So good afternoon. My name is Morgan King, and I am the Climate Campaign Coordinator at West Virginia Rivers Coalition. And today we are going to talk about the impact of methane pollution in West Virginia and some opportunities to take action and move the state and our country in a positive direction around addressing this methane pollution and other toxic pollutants that come with methane. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, so today we're going to be talking about methane, how it affects public health and climate change. And I'll be presenting for 10, maybe 15 minutes to share with you all some of the facts around this issue, and then share with you all some opportunities to take action to address methane pollution. So we'll get started. And then we'll also have time at the end of this presentation for questions. So feel free to drop your questions in the chat while I'm presenting, and we'll get to them after the presentation, or you can hold off and voice them verbally after this slideshow. So to kick things off, we might ask, what is methane? And methane is a hydrocarbon with the formula CH4. You can see the molecule there to the right-hand side of the screen. It's a colorless, odorless, and highly flammable gas, and it's a primary component of natural gas. So when you hear about oil and natural gas production, it would not be possible without the chemical compound of methane. And what's really important about methane for our context is that it's a greenhouse gas. So you might ask, where does methane come from? There are different ways that methane can get into the atmosphere and become a greenhouse gas. The first is through anthropogenic sources, which means human-caused or human-influenced sources. And then there's some other ways that methane is produced naturally, but we're not going to talk about those today. What we're really concerned about are the human-influenced or anthropogenic sources of methane. So some of the ways that methane can get into the atmosphere is through landfills, coal mining, stationary and mobile combustion, wastewater treatment, and industrial processes. But the two largest sources of methane in the United States are via agricultural activities through enteric fermentation. So that's like when you have livestock and the cows, for instance, burp, for lack of a better phrase, and that methane goes into the atmosphere. So 27% of methane from the United States is through agricultural activities, particularly livestock. But even more than that, oil and natural gas systems cause 32% of American sources of anthropogenic methane pollution. But this is just from estimates by the Environmental Protection Agency. Research that came out recently by the Environmental Defense Fund has shown that oil and gas emissions are actually 60% higher than what the EPA estimates. And so why is this a problem? How do oil and gas systems cause methane pollution? Well, there's 4 different ways that methane can get into the atmosphere and pollute our communities. The first is when natural gas is flared or vented. The second is when methane is released in leaks. So these are sometimes known as fugitive emissions. So when you hear the term methane leak, it's really just code for more methane pollution. The third way that methane can get into the atmosphere from oil and gas systems is during all phases of drilling and production. So this might refer to flaring or venting through leaks, and then other activities that happen during the production of oil and gas. And then finally, it can happen in post-production. So even if there are oil and gas wells that are not active, they're inactive, there are abandoned and orphaned oil and gas wells that have been improperly plugged or not plugged at all, and they are leaking or polluting methane into the atmosphere. So what is the impact? If this methane leaks and pollutes our communities and gets into the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas, what impacts are there? Well, the first is climate change. Methane pollution is often not talked about as much as carbon dioxide as a contributor to climate change, but it's actually the second most abundant greenhouse gas. So carbon dioxide is the first one, but the amount of methane contributing to climate change is not insignificant at all. Methane's actually responsible for 20% of global emissions. So 20% of global emissions currently. But it's actually over 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide at trapping heat within the first 20 years in the atmosphere. And historically, methane has been estimated to cause a quarter, 25% of global warming to date. So beyond climate change and the overarching global impacts of methane pollution, which of course has local impacts, it can cause climate impacts, which West Virginia is no stranger to through more severe flooding and heat waves. As more greenhouse gases contribute to global warming and change our climate, we're going to see more impacts. So that's one aspect locally where methane pollution can affect our climate and public health. But even more directly, methane pollution has a direct impact on exacerbating health risks in our communities. So the first is when methane's released during operations, volatile organic compounds are also released. And they together can combine with sunlight and so the methane, the VOCs, volatile organic compounds, and sunlight, when together can react and cause ozone smog and other particulate matter pollution. These toxic chemicals can worsen respiratory diseases, increase the risk of cancer, cardiovascular diseases. Then also during development, toxic compounds like benzene and xylene are also emitted, and these are known human carcinogens. And then finally, very concerning toxic compounds that are produced during oil and gas operations alongside methane are nitrogen oxides. And these happen with gas flaring and engines at natural gas facilities. And these also can react together with methane and VOC pollution to form even more ozone smog. These can impair lung function, trigger asthma attacks, and aggravate diseases like bronchitis and emphysema. And so in particular, people that have existing respiratory conditions or chronic conditions would be at highest risk, along with the elderly, with children that are particularly susceptible to some of these health risks already. And even more, it creates a feedback loop. So as more methane is emitted along with these other toxic compounds, that contributes to greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which contributes to our changing climate. That leads to more hotter temperatures on average, more stagnant air, and then that can even further intensify the ozone smog levels that we'll see as a result of these toxic compounds combining with methane and sunlight. But why does that really affect West Virginia? So beyond the public health risk overall from methane and these toxic compounds, it exacerbates public health crises we already have in West Virginia. West Virginia's ranking highest in the nation for the prevalence of heart attacks and coronary heart disease. We've got the second highest cancer mortality rate. We're among the worst ranked for chronic respiratory diseases, and we're one of the oldest populations in the nation. So add that public health risk of methane and toxic pollution on top of the public health crises we are experiencing, West Virginians can be particularly vulnerable to these negative health outcomes. But even more, it's important to understand what is our risk? Where are there risks of methane pollution in West Virginia? And overall in the country, more than 17.3 million people live within a half-mile threat radius of active oil and gas production operations. But a significant portion of that is in West Virginia and in Appalachia. And to put a number to it, over half of West Virginians in our state live within just 1 mile of an active oil and gas well. And then to add on top of that, there are 6,500 abandoned and orphaned oil and gas wells that are not plugged or improperly plugged. So this is adding to more of those sources of methane pollution that we talked about at the start of this slideshow. If you're curious too about where you specifically live and how methane could be affecting your communities or neighborhoods, you can go to oilandgasthreatmap.com and type in your address and see what type of development is located around you. Even more beyond all of the active oil and gas wells and the abandoned wells, there's a specific type of oil and gas well that's of particular concern, and that's something called a low producing oil and gas well. And they make up 8 in 10 of all American oil and gas wells. That's a massive percentage of all of our oil and gas operations. But interestingly enough, they only produce 6% of our nation's oil and gas. And they cause 50% of all well site pollution. So these low producing oil and gas wells don't contribute much to our nation's oil and gas development, but they contribute significantly to the pollution that we experience. And even more relevant to us in West Virginia and in our Appalachian region is that the highest number of oil and gas wells that are low producing in the country are located in Appalachia. You can see in the map to the left that over 180,000 of them are just located in the Appalachian region. And if you look to the bar graph at the bottom of that chart, you can see that Appalachia experiences the highest average annual methane emission from this type of low producing well. And for example, in West Virginia, you can break it down by the county level of how many of these wells there are. And 3,300 of them are in Kanawha County alone. And I use that example just because that's where I live. I live in the Charleston area. And Kanawha County has the highest number of these low producing wells in the state, but there are still obviously many, many others across the state and other counties. So you might ask, this sounds pretty grim. What are we going to do about this? Is our state or federal government doing anything? And the good news is, the answer is yes. The Environmental Protection Agency has released an updated rule to cut methane and other harmful pollutants by oil and gas operations. And this was released in November, and it builds on some draft rules that they've been working on for a couple years. And some of the most notable aspects that they have in this new rule is they work to strengthen leak detection and repair requirements so they can find where the leaks are and the pollution is, and stop that pollution. They're going to increase inspections, or they're looking to increase inspections at small wells, looking to update and require better equipment so that there are zero emissions of other toxic compounds in the entire oil and gas operation process. They're looking at ensuring that super emitters, so companies or sites of oil and gas operations that emit the most are monitored through third-party organizations. Particularly important for West Virginia, they're looking to ensure that abandoned wells are subject to inspections until closure. That's something that will really affect and benefit our state, given the 6,500 abandoned and orphaned oil and gas wells that we just simply don't have the quantity of inspectors that we need to cover this and cover all of those abandoned wells and active wells. And finally, they're looking to require companies to submit a closure plan for after operations cease, and have a post-closure survey of wells to ensure that the full loop is closed and we don't have any more of these abandoned and orphaned oil and gas wells. So the EPA is actually accepting public comment on this proposal until Monday, on February 13th. And you might ask, well, what can I do? Well, we have 3 great ways that you can get involved if the concern of methane is one that's really close to your heart. The first is you can learn more. West Virginia Rivers has some resources online at wvrivers.org/methane. We have links to some of the maps and the data that we have been talking about today, and you can dive deeper into that if you're interested. And all of these links will be put in the chat, so you don't have to worry about typing them in yourself. You can just click on it from there. The next thing you could do is take action. So submitting an official public comment to the EPA is a great way to share with the EPA that you are a West Virginian and you care about strong methane protections to protect community health and address climate change. And West Virginia Rivers has made it easy for you to do this by visiting our action alert and putting in your information, and all you have to do is click send, and you can submit a public comment that way. You can even edit it to add more personal details if you should so choose. And finally, you can use your network. Some of the strongest ways that we can build change together is through our own networks and through activities like friend banking, where you text a friend this opportunity, and now you've already doubled your impact by, if you share the action alert with a friend, now your one public comment has turned into 2. So you can share that on social media, you can share that with your friends personally, and this will just amplify our impact and voice. And finally, if you do share things on social media, definitely tag West Virginia Rivers on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and you can see our handles there to the right side of the screen. So thanks so much for bearing with me and listening to this, and we'd be more than happy to take questions for the next 10, 11 minutes so that we're cognizant of your time in this half-hour lunch and learn. And also, if you have additional questions that you don't want to ask today, feel free to email me. My email's there on the page, mking@wvrivers.org, and I'd be more than happy to talk with you or answer any questions you have.